The New Yorker magazine was first published by Harold Ross and Jane Grant in February 1925, and although he was never officially given the title, they employed Ray Irvin as their art editor, and his image of the character Eustace Tilley, who would become the magazine's mascot, appeared on the cover of the first edition. Irvin had previously been the art editor at the humour magazine Life, and was known for his own modernistic comedic approach to illustration. And this was naturally enough reflected in the images he both produced and commissioned for the covers of the New Yorker. Hungarian-born Ilonka Karas was among the earliest that Irvin chose to create cover illustration, and her stylistic approach was a highly decorative blend of modernism and folk art, and featured a distinctive disregard for accurate representational drawing. Coincidentally, Irvin's second most popular choice in the first year of publication was another Hungarian émigré, Julian Domiski. His style resonated more clearly with the same playful modernisms as Irvin's own, and characters and environments were treated as purely graphic shapes and flat colours. Both these illustrators helped to make the new magazine stand out from the less radical opposition at the newsstands. The same was true of Barbara Sherman, whose cover work at this stage at least also conformed to the modernist principles, which were very much encouraged by Irvin. German-born illustrator H.O. Hoffman was equally committed to geometry and graphic minimalism, and was arguably the most stylistically extreme of the group at this point. And although, like Barbara Sherman, the stylistic approach of Garrett Price would quickly evolve out of all recognition, at this time he too created covers using clean line work and vibrant limited colour. Some of the illustrators who appeared in the first year of publication, such as Danish designer Max Ray, had only a brief association with the New Yorker. But all those already mentioned would be around for considerably longer, and so would Stanley Reynolds, who first appeared in 1926. He had a very good run with his portrayals of languid male and female characters, using a style which was heavily influenced by the fashion illustrations being produced in 1920s Paris. In the same year, he was joined by the always frivolous, if radically angular work of Armenian-born illustrator Konstantin Aladjalov, and the similarly inclined Ukrainian immigrant Vladimir Bobritsky, both of whom were graphically exploring the fractured structural approaches of European art movements such as Cubism and Futurism, but with considerably more humour. Within a couple of years of first being published, the New Yorker had gained a strong reputation for the high standard of the visual content created by this group of mostly European illustrators. Of course, there continued to be a fairly large number of covers produced by Irvin himself, and by this point it could be said that the New Yorker's covers had become an effective gallery of upbeat imaginative imagery produced in a collective modernist or Deco house style. But early in 1927, the more gestural loose line and washwork of Peter Arno began to appear on the cover, and not much later the similarly loose pen and ink drawings of Helen Hokinson also appeared. Both had been creating jokes for the pages of the magazine pretty much since it began, but in the later years of the decade they also featured with increasing frequency on the covers, and their more gestural and informal styling was noticeably distant from the more formal precision of the other early contributors. But although the inclusion of Arno and Hokinson definitely made the covers more varied, it was largely business as usual in stylistic terms, with more from Irvin himself and the majority of others with similar stylistic inclinations. And they were joined around this time by Leonard Dove, whose style was, at the time, strikingly similar to Irvin's own. And in the last years of the 1920s, the group were joined by Theodor Haupt, who was arguably the most resolutely geometric and modernist of the stable of contributors. His radically styled compositions were dominant into the early 1930s, but not much later he began to have success as an artist, and that was the last the New Yorker or any other commercial enterprise ever saw of him. By the early 1930s, it seems that several of the old guard, including Dumiskin and Agilov, who had also by this point mysteriously lost the D in his surname, had become noticeably less formal in their illustrations, with manifestly freehand elements and textures creeping into their engagingly playful work. Whether this was at least in part the consequence of the continued presence and influence of Hokinson and Arno is up for debate, but all the new recruits in the early 1930s were considerably looser in their line work and more painterly application of colour. William Steig began to feature regularly at this time, and he certainly owed something to the style of Peter Arno. His good-natured humorous images, created with bold brush line work and subdued colour washes, were barely recognisable as the work of the same man who would later create the children's book Shrek. Perry Barlow's drawings bore more than a passing resemblance to Helen Hokinson's pen and wash technique and taste for whimsical status-driven subject matter. And similarly, Richard Decker also created amusing light watercolours which nodded towards the style and humour of Hokinson. Abner Dean also made his debut on the cover in 1933, but his appearance was relatively brief, and in his later work in the books he produced, he became increasingly psychological and dark, qualities only suggested in his covers at this stage. Although hardly a newcomer as he'd been with the New Yorker since 1925, Garrett Price created several covers at this time, and by now his previously graphic flat technique had evolved into a spectacularly dissimilar loose pen and wash style. And the same was true of fellow long-term contributor Barbara Sherman, now displaying not only a sharp talent for social humour, but also a sketchy ink line and wash technique a considerable way distant from her early covers. Of the newer talents, perhaps the most distinctive was Harry Brown, whose work was frequently to be found on the covers at this time. There were some echoes of both Alagilov and Karras evident in his illustrations, but his playful and always visually absorbing scenarios featured a pleasingly diverse approach to his choice of media and application. Leonard Dove, who had first appeared a decade earlier with a style close to Irving's own, was yet another who had also undergone an organic transformation along the same lines as that of other long-standing contributors. So by the mid-1930s, the graphic tone of the covers had evolved considerably in the space of a decade, not only reflecting but to an extent actually being a driving force in this move away from more formal image creation. And other than the covers still being created by Irving himself, Ilonka Karras was one of very few whose stylistic approach had not been significantly transformed by the passage of time and changes in fashion. In the later 1930s, there continued to be an apparently endless supply of younger talent waiting for their chance to shine. And among them was William Cotton, who favoured a naive painted approach which featured virtually no line work, and Richard Taylor, whose distinctive cartoon styling and subtle humour would endure for quite a few more years. In 1939, after 15 years in the role, Ray Irving bowed out as art editor, even though in all that time it had never been his official job title. Even forgetting that his role had also extended to the content of the magazine's pages, there had been around 780 covers produced in that time, quite a few by the man himself. And he continued to contribute to the magazine as an illustrator of enduring popularity until his eventual retirement in 1958 when he was 75 years old. As I write this in 2023, The New Yorker is still published, and despite the almost total dominance of photography in contemporary magazine publishing, I'm glad to say its covers continue to be imaginatively illustrated. But Ray Irving's early contribution both as a creator and commissioner to the modernisation of 20th century American illustration should never be underestimated, and I think it's doubtful we'll see another anytime soon who might equal the significance of that contribution.